Hey everyone, and welcome back to our readings of The Magic Tree House, Stallion by Starlight. Today we're going to be reading chapter 6, and we last left Jack and Annie as they had been getting to know Alexander some more, and they were finding out that he was not a very nice person, and Jack really didn't like him or trust him or want to be around him. And the last they saw of Alexander was he was running towards the racetrack as the king and his men were pulling out some horses from the barn. So, let's see what that was all about, and let's get into chapter 6. Annie sighed. I agree with you, but what are we going to do? I don't know. Jack dropped his head into his hands. His skull was pounding. He felt like he might throw up. Do you want to leave Macedonia? Asked Annie. No, said Jack, shaking his head. You want to stay? Annie said. No, said Jack. Jack! Annie! Someone shouted. Jack lifted his head. Aristotle was striding toward them. When he reached them, he looked at Jack and said, You need water. Come with me. Annie helped Jack to his feet. Jack still felt wobbly as they followed Aristotle to a well near the royal house. He and Annie splashed water from a bucket onto their faces and drank from their cupped hands. The cool, clear water made Jack feel better. Thank you, he said. Did the prince make a proper fool of you? Aristotle asked Jack. More or less, said Jack. Ah, you are not the only one, Aristotle said. It's because he so greatly fears looking like a fool himself. He is desperate to equal his father's power and strength. Well, someone needs to remind him he is only 12, said Annie. Aristotle smiled. I agree. Where is he now? He ran to see the horses, said Annie. Ah, yes, said Aristotle, peering down the hill. The king's companions are all eager to see the war horses a seller has brought from Thessaly. Would you like to see them too? I love horses, said Annie, but she looked at Jack. You guys go. I'll wait here, he said. He didn't want to be anywhere near Prince Alexander. I don't want to leave you, said Annie. Please come with us, please. Jack stared at her and then sighed. Okay, he said. As Aristotle, Jack, and Annie started down the hill, the sun was low in the sky. Jack was silent as Annie chatted with Aristotle. So, do war horses go to war? She asked. Aristotle nodded. They carry soldiers to war in lands near and far, he said. Their speed and strength can help save a man's life or win a battle. What a hard job, said Annie. Yes, but they are the most honored horses in the kingdom, said Aristotle. When Jack, Annie, and Aristotle reached the riding ring, the horses were all standing in a row, with grooms attending them. As the king's companions watched from outside the fence, King Philip and the small, wiry horse seller walked together down the line, discussing each animal. Alexander walked behind them, looking in the horses' mouths and feeling their legs. The prince loves horses too, Aristotle said. Too bad for those horses, said Jack. What are they looking for? Annie asked. Thick bones, strong teeth, and a good bend in the knees, said Aristotle. A broad chest and a high-set neck, bony head, large nostrils, a thick mane, and small ears. That's a lot, Annie said. The king came to the end of the line and began to haggle with the horse seller. Alexander tried to be part of the conversation, but his father silenced him. Jack almost felt sorry for the prince. King Philip pointed to a couple of horses. The horse seller nodded, and the grooms led all the horses from the riding ring back into the barn. The setting sun flashed over the hillside. The horse trading is over for today, said Aristotle. It will resume at daylight tomorrow. Suddenly, a black stallion bolted from the barn. Several grooms ran after him. The stallion was stunningly beautiful. As he trotted around the ring, the light of the setting sun seemed to set his dark coat and mane on fire. He held his head high and arched his neck. He had small ears and wide eyes. That must be a magnificent horse I have heard so much about, said Aristotle. Who is he? Asked Annie. His name is Bucephalus, said Aristotle. He once belonged to the royal horse master of Thessaly. When the stallion slowed to a walk, a groom approached him and tried to grab his bridle. But as the man's shadow fell over Bucephalus, the stallion neighed and bucked. He broke away from the man and backed against the fence. His ears were flat against his head. His eyes were wild. What's going on? Said Annie. He was once a noble war horse, said Aristotle, but ever since he was captured in battle, he has not let any rider mount him. Why? Asked Annie. No one knows, but the seller insists he can be tamed again and wants a bag of gold for him. A groom threw a rope around the horse's neck. Another brought out a whip. What's that for? Asked Annie. The groom cracked the whip on the ground. No, shouted Prince Alexander. Put the whip down. The groom cracked his whip again. The horse reared up. Arching his neck, he kicked his hooves, almost trampling the man who held the whip. The grooms jumped back to avoid being crushed. No, shouted Alexander again, rushing forward. Don't hit him. He grabbed the whip from the groom and threw it to the ground. Do not be a fool, the king roared at the prince. Let them do their job. Alexander ignored his father. He walked calmly toward the stallion. The horse stared at him for a moment, then took off across the ring. Alexander started running after him. Stop him, the king ordered his bodyguards. Two of the guards rushed forward and grabbed Alexander before he reached the horse. They held the prince as more grooms approached Bucephalus. The stallion reared up again. This horse cannot be tamed, the king shouted at the horse seller. Yes, he can, shouted Alexander. He tried to break free from the guards, but they held him tightly. And I am the only one who can tame him. Take him from my sight. He is worthless, shouted the king. Jack couldn't tell if the king meant the stallion or the prince. The grooms drove the black stallion back into the stable, and the guards held on to Alexander as they followed the king and his companions back up the hill. Several times, the king turned and shouted at his son, You fool! So reckless! Arrogant! Excuse me, said Aristotle. I must try and calm the king. He strode away, leaving Jack and Annie alone. Boy, Alexander's dad is really mean to him, said Annie. I noticed that at the house, said Jack. He kept telling Alexander to be quiet. Jack and Annie were quiet themselves as they watched King Philip yell at the prince all the way back to the royal house. By the time the king and his party had gone inside, the sun had slipped behind the hill. Night was falling fast. The air had grown cooler. I know we think Alexander's a mean kid and a show-off, said Annie, but just now he was trying to protect the black stallion. Jack didn't say anything. And we were kind of mean to him too, actually, said Annie. We made fun of him and stuff. We did. He deserved it, Jack mumbled. But the truth is, we were showing off a little too, said Annie, to the king and his men. Fine. So what's your point? Jack said. We're even, said Annie. Maybe we should start over with him. Oh, brother, said Jack. But he actually agreed with her. Strangely, his anger at the prince had faded. He even felt sorry for him now. I think his life is pretty sad, said Annie. Maybe we could help him somehow. How do you help a kid like that? Said Jack. I don't know, said Annie. Well, let's start with the question, said Jack. What do we know about him so far? We know he craves excellence and glory, said Annie. That's what Aristotle told us. We know he's desperate to equal his father's power and strength, said Annie. And he thinks he's the great-great-grandson of Hercules, said Jack. Right. He's a living Greek god, Annie said. And the world's greatest athlete, said Jack. And soon he'll be master of the universe, said Annie. Annie laughed, and Jack laughed with her. He's ridiculous, Jack said, shaking his head. I've never met a kid like him before, said Annie. Thank goodness, said Jack. But we also know something else about him, said Annie. What? Said Jack. We know he loves Bucephalus. Yeah? So? Said Jack. So let's start there, said Annie. Love is always a good place to start. Don't you think? So, very interesting chapter where we learn a little bit more about Alexander and his life and maybe what is making him so mean. So, our next chapter is chapter 7, and chapter 7 is called Stallion at Starlight. Do you think the stallion our book is about is this black stallion, Bucephalus? Well, we'll have to keep reading to find out. Join me tomorrow for chapter 7. Bye!